And I'm going to start at this end with Sheri Fink. Sheri is the author of 5 Days at Memorial from Crown. And 5 Days at Memorial is a story that, it's a book that emerged out of some reporting that you did. This is a Pulitzer Prize winning story that it emerges out of. And let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, is the mic on? Can everybody hear? No.
So I think
oh, there we go.
There we go.
Well, thanks. It's wonderful to be here today. And I was up, we were just talking how we were all up late last night reading each other's galleys. And there's so much resonance between the different books, I think, on this panel, you know, end-of-life issues and euthanasia, happy issues like that. But I feel like we're kind of capturing a moment in a way, family caregiving at both ends of life. And so I think, you know, for me, these stories are kind of timeless and also timely. And in this story in particular, 5 Days at Memorial, I think all of us watched the tornado in Moore, Oklahoma, and we saw how critical infrastructure is, the schools, the hospitals, where the most vulnerable people are. And 5 Days at Memorial, in its broadest sense, is about what happens when the infrastructure fails when we need it the most. And kind of what happens when the things that we rely on, you know, fail us in those moments. And so in particular, as you probably remember, August 29th, 2005, when Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast and the levees failed and the city of New Orleans, this cherished American city, was underwater. And 5 Days at Memorial is a story that sort of trickled into the news right after the disaster, where there were these crazy allegations that doctors and nurses might have euthanized their patients in the horrific circumstances that followed. And I am a physician by training, and I've worked in disaster and conflict zones as an aid worker. And my first book was about a war hospital in Bosnia in the midst of a genocide. But I had never heard of things getting so desperate, except like in movies, that there was you know, that doctors and nurses had resorted to hastening the deaths of their patients. So I set out to understand what really happened there, and the result is this book, 6 years of research, and it really looks at, you know, day by day. The first half of the book goes, you know, the day the storm hits, and then, like, you know, your hospital, my hospital, perhaps, there are these vulnerabilities. In this hospital, the backup power did not power the air conditioning system, and so it grew very hot. And then the next day, the waters rose, and the staff knew, because the generator elements were in the basement, that the power was about to go out. And this question of triage and, like, who do we save when it looks like there's not going to be enough resources to go around? And, you know, do you take the sickest people because they need help the most, or do you take the healthier people because you can get them out faster and they might live longer, or do you consider age? So that was like the first ethical inflection point. And then what happened was that indeed the power went out, the situation became very desperate, caregivers were fearful of their own lives, let alone the lives of their patients. And so the second half of the book basically follows an investigator and prosecutor team as they discover that 12.5 of these patients that died with these powerful drugs in their bodies. And in fact, some of those deaths were very disturbing. One of them in particular, 61-year-old Emmett Everett, who was ate his breakfast that last morning on that 5th day, asked his nurses, "Are we ready to rock and roll?" But he weighed 380 pounds in a hospital with no elevators, and he was on the 7th floor. And he was one of the patients who was found dead with these drugs in his body. And so this culminates in the arrest of this doctor and 2 nurses, and then it falls to a prosecutor to prosecute them for second-degree murder, and he starts wondering how he can apply justice in a situation like this, in what is essentially a war zone. And so what I want people to take away from this is that in every disaster where I've worked, it's really you and me. It's the individuals that are trapped when everything else fails, because it always fails. It's individual decision making. It's us thinking about these issues before we ever have to face them, and hopefully we never do. And so I wanted to bring the reader into that world and have to face these decisions and think about these things before they ever got there.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you. And to Sheri's right is Eric Lundgren. He is one of 2 novelists on this year's Buzz panel. And if I remember correctly, you're a librarian? Yep. Right. So librarian love for this fall. His novel is called The Facades. It's published by Overlook. And one of the things I love about this, and you can tell us about the main story as well, but one of the things I love about this is that he basically has invented this mythical city, and the city's landscape, which is vividly described, is an integral part of the emotional story as well. That it's a city where landscape really does inform emotional resonance. So tell us a little bit about that.
My novel is.
Get out of the way of the.
Okay.
Introvert's nightmare.
It's essentially about a man whose wife disappears, and it takes place in this fictional city, which is drawn from Italo Calvino's novel Invisible Cities, but also draws heavily on my experiences in the Midwest. It's a sort of amalgam of Midwestern places, both real and imagined. And this fellow is sort of he's a law clerk who works in a strip mall, and he's married to this woman who's a mezzo-soprano in the opera company in Trude. And so the situation is a little weird from the beginning, but it gets much stranger after her disappearance. And Norberg, my main character, is forced to confront some unhelpful detectives, and there's a confrontation between a group of librarians and the mayor that has led to an armed standoff in front of the Central Library. So it's this kind of off-kilter landscape that I hope is kind of true to a certain strange Midwestern reality, while at the same time being sort of slightly fantastical. But that's the basic outline. There's also, as the book progresses, Norberg kind of searches for his wife Molly through a series of buildings. These are designed by a sort of embittered modernist architect from Austria, and who becomes increasingly important as the book goes on. So that's the basic outline.
Yeah, and I think if you like novelists like Donald Antrim and A.M. Holmes, that you're really going to want to check out The Facades. So thank you. Now to Eric's right is Katy Butler. Katy is the author of Knocking on Heaven's Door, which is published by Scribner. And this is another story that grew out of a magazine article in which you started with a very personal story. I mean, it doesn't get much more personal than your family, but you've kind of started with your family, and then, as we were saying earlier, talking about this as a generational touchstone issue.
Can you hear me? Is the mic on?
There we go.
Can you hear me now? No. Can you hear me now? No? Can you hear me now? I have to get this close.
There we go.
Okay. Thank you so much. And I guess I first just want to make clear that my book is not about euthanasia, but it is, like Sheri's book, it's about preserving your autonomy in the face of the medical system. It's this. I'm going to first just tell you about something that just happened, which is my husband has an aunt called Aunt Dot. She was 94. She was at a family party, and she was enjoying a slice of red velvet cake, and she had a massive fainting spell and was taken to the hospital. And the doctors wanted to keep her overnight and run numerous tests with her. And her son George is an auto mechanic on Long Island, and he simply said, this is not going to happen. She wants to go home and finish her cake, and that's what she's doing. And he took her home, she finished her cake, and she lived another 3 years without a lot of complicated medical intervention, because her son really had a gut sense of what was appropriate at this stage of life. She died only a month ago in her own bed, a really good death. And I would say that's the essence of what my book's about, which is how do we have a good death? Because we live in an era of advanced medical technology that is extraordinary in its ability to save lives and even prolong lives, and then also sometimes in prolonging a dying. So it's led us to lose touch with ancient traditions of spiritual acceptance, bravery, and forethought that lead to good deaths at the right time. So it's both a memoir and a work of narrative nonfiction. It's investigative reporting. So it tells the story of my struggle to give my parents the peaceful, natural deaths that they wanted, because they were very clear about their wishes. And it also talks about the forces within medicine and within our own hearts and our own ignorance and terror of death that stood in the way of those good deaths. My father was 79 when he had a devastating stroke. My mother became a full-time caregiver, and I joined the rollerboard generation, which is going back and forth across the country now, hiring caregivers, racking up frequent flyer miles. And a year later, my father was given a pacemaker with very little thought, and it kept him going as he descended into dementia and near blindness and so much misery that he actually said to my mother, "I'm living too long." She and I asked doctors to turn off the pacemaker. They refused. And the extra years the pacemaker gave my father were the very worst of a very long life. So I was a journalist. I couldn't understand exactly how had we gotten here as a culture. And my search led me all the way back to the 1450s when the bestseller, undoubtedly sold by independent booksellers, was called The Art of Dying, which actually trained our ancestors how to prepare for their own deathbeds. And it also led me to the 50s and 60s when we had a panoply of life-saving inventions. And those inventions led to a hugely profitable business and a very powerful Washington lobby that has deformed the way our healthcare system deals with the end of life. So I just got one more, okay? Which is that the book ends with my mother's death. She refused open heart surgery. She had a heart attack. Doctors wanted to, again, they proposed very elaborate surgery. She refused. And then when she had a heart attack, they again proposed surgery, and I called her and said, "I think we're grasping." And she finished my sentence and said, "At straws." She said, "It's hard to give up hope." Half an hour later, she called me back and said, "I want you to give my sewing machine to a woman who really sews. It's a Bernina, it's all metal, it has no plastic parts." And I said, "But I'd like your sewing machine." She said, "Yeah, but Katy, you don't sew," okay? So she had a chance to say to my brother, "Please forgive me." I had a chance to say to her that I would miss her. And she really died a good death. And that's really the point of the book, is to encourage people to find their way through this labyrinth of modern dying and to make sure they leave the opportunities for red velvet cake.
Okay. So Wendy Lauer is the author of Hitler's Furies. It's published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. It is about the role of German women in the Third Reich and the Nazi Holocaust. And one of the things that I was struck by is that although this is your first mainstream commercial book, this emerges out of your academic research into the Nazi invasion in the Ukraine. So let's talk very quickly about that.
Can you hear me? Okay. I'm very comfortable seated here, so if you don't mind, I'm just going to stay in my seat. My book is about the Holocaust, and when you think about the Holocaust, you probably think about places like Auschwitz-Birkenau and gassing facilities. And if you think about perpetrators of the Holocaust, you think primarily about men and different types of men, sadists, technocrats, banal desk murderers, people like Eichmann, obviously Himmler, Hitler. And if you think about women, you might think about camp guards primarily, right? So if you've read The Reader, or if you've seen some of these depictions of female camp guards, about 3,000 of them, that is your association in terms of female participation in the Holocaust. You might also think about the fact that, from the book Bloodlands, for instance, that a lot of the crimes we now know occurred in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Belarus, in Ukraine, in the Baltics. And that half the victims of the Holocaust did not die in these gassing facilities, but died in open mass shootings, open air mass shootings, and in ghetto liquidations. Now, where does my story come into this? Well, I ended up discovering that German women, an entire generation of German women, I call the lost generation. There were 40 million German women in Germany, but about 500,000 of them went east. They went right into these killing zones that we don't think of women circulating in these areas of Eastern Europe, that they were present. We think of the German women back in the home front, holding down the hearth, subjected to the aerial bombings and so forth. But they actually were mobilized in huge numbers as nurses, as secretaries, which I then turn into kind of desk murderers because they're implementing the Holocaust in these remote locations, as the wives and lovers of SS men and other officials. So I put them on the map of the killing field, which has not been done before. Now, once I realized that there was a significant number of women involved in these crimes, I need to think about how to convey that story, how to make it accessible to as many people as possible. So what I did was that I selected 13 biographies, 13 women who I thought were the most representative of this generation, and 13 women whose lives I could best reconstruct based on the source material, and I've been working in this field for about 20 years. And so these women are women who come all the way to the present day. I've interviewed some of them, and what I do is in the beginning of the book, I set up this cast of characters. You're not quite sure where these women are going to end up once they go east. Will they be witnesses? Will they be accomplices? Will they actually be killers? And that's the kind of tension of the book, of that journey of these women to the east, their transformation, and ultimately what they end up doing when they are face to face with this violence. In the end, after I trace their biographies, and I could go into details about these individual biographies, they're vivid, they're powerful, they're shocking, disturbing. I go back in the closing chapter of my book, deal with the questions of why they killed, what happened to them after the war, where they tried. One of them was indicted for the murder of 9,000 Jews and was acquitted. The last part of the book, I go to one of the killing sites. The book begins with the crime scenes in the East, and it ends with my return to actually one of these sites. And I do that because I want to go back to where the victims, in one case, Erna Petrie, one of the primary perpetrators who shot 6 Jewish children point blank in the back of the neck. I wanted to go back to the site where that actually happened and restore kind of the fact that these were victims, real victims, these young boys she killed. Had they survived, they might have gone on to some incredibly amazing things we don't know, but in the end, we need to go back to those actual sites and recognize those lives.
It's really riveting passages, and I hope you'll check that. So, to Wendy's right is Jennifer Senior. Jennifer is the author of All Joy and No Fun. It's from Echo, and it emerges from some reporting that she has done for New York Magazine over the last few years. And let's talk about the blend of narrative nonfiction and your own personal experience in terms of parenthood that is being covered here.
My own personal experience is barely in this book. It is purely research driven. I think I mentioned in the introduction, people hear me? Is this on?
Yep.
Okay. I mentioned in the introduction that I'm a mother, just so that everyone understands who the narrator is. But what the book is about, essentially, is if you go to the bookstore, you will see many, many books on the shelves describing how parents can influence their children. There's no shortage of books out there that describe how to raise a 21st century optimized child. There is very little I can think of that talks about the way children influence their parents. It's a very strange thing. No one flips the telescope around and says, how do these people influence us? And if you think about it, it's very strange that this doesn't exist, because in some ways the effects of children on parents are much easier to measure. We know what it was like before and after. We know what our marriages or our relationships were like. We know what our professions were like. We know what the wiring diagrams of our social lives looked like, and we know what our private universes of expectation and fantasies look like. And then your kids come along and they're different, right? From a kid's point of view, they can't tell you what was different before their parents came. There's no way to know. So I was very interested in this lacuna in the literature, that there is nothing out there that sort of looks at how kids affect their parents all their lives. It grew out of a story that, and so just to say, to repeat, I'm not in the book. It's not, because the only
book.
kinds of books that are out there that do tend to do this a little bit are memoirs. And boy, is this not that. So this grew out of a piece that I did for New York Magazine, which examined, I wanted to interrogate a very peculiar, very robust finding in the social sciences, which is that parents are supposedly not as happy as those who don't have kids. This is consistent. You'll run into it practically in every discipline in the social sciences. And it violates some of our deepest intuitions. It doesn't make much sense. And when I read it, I thought, well, this is exactly right and exactly wrong. It's both. And a family social scientist, a professor of family social science, eventually gave me the way to think about it, which is that raising children is high cost, high reward. And that is what this book tries to do. I recruit from sociology, psychology, economics, anthropology, philosophy, history, lots of history, to look at the ways that children affect their parents, how this might have changed over the years. And I don't just look at it in the beginning, which is what a lot of this literature tends to do, is just sort of look at the transition to parenthood. The way that a 2-year-old affects their parents is very different from the way an 8-year-old affects their parents, and that's very different from the way an 18-year-old affects their parents. The pandemonium of the early years looks nothing like the frustrations and anxieties of the later years. So the book progresses chronologically. Like I use families, individual families, to demonstrate certain phenomena, like certain aspects of the difficulties of raising children, and the high rewards, the things that completely slip through the sieve of social science that you can't measure. Joy is very hard to capture in social science. It's much easier to capture things that bug people, but I do both. I spent time in Minnesota and in Texas, and there's not a whole lot of New York in here. New York parents are a whole other breed. Anyway, so yeah, right.
And the fly on the wall reporting is really
yes,
fast.
it's all fly on the wall.
All
sitting with families.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so our last Buzz author today is Amy Grace Loyd. In her day job, she is the executive editor of Byliner.com. But in her debut novel, The Affairs of Others, which is published by Picador, she has a really wonderful story set in Brooklyn with a first-person narrator who is a landlord who sort of gets swept up in the lives, not just in her life, but in the lives of her tenants. And let's talk a little bit about your story and how you came to write it.
Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me? How about now? I'm afraid to move because I have flounce, and flounce will make for funny sounds. So before joining Byliner, I worked in print publishing, book publishing, as well as magazines. And my last job, sorry, this is a little awkward, guys. It's me and my shirt, was at Playboy. I was there for almost 7 years. And the narrator of this book, if you guys have heard anything about her, is someone who doesn't want to be in the world in the way a Playboy editor often has to be. All of us who work in publishing, or we write, we research, we're like cyborgs. We're on the email, we're on the Twitter, our device is never far away. Celia, for me, was a great refuge because she doesn't want to have anything to do with that. She's a young widow. She buys this building with the money she's inherited and tries to create a sort of sanctuary, a world over which she, at least ostensibly, has control. She sublets an apartment above her to a recently betrayed, middle-aged, very beautiful woman who embarks on a sexy, noisy love affair with an old boyfriend, and her world begins to shift little by little. Her voice for me was a great refuge, reserved, doesn't want to play by other people's rules, wants to live in the past because that's where love lies for her. And also, for me, it was a way of talking about sex in a different way, the ways in which sex is emotional connection and sustenance and nourishment, but also the ways it can be blunting and estranging, because Celia in this book encounters both those sorts of things. And I miss her. And the book moves from a kind of sorrow to a really joyful place. And I want to commend the BEA for choosing these books, because I think all of them are about different forms of courage, different forms of kind of confronting the dark and hopefully moving into the light. And Celia definitely does that, and along the way she will confound you. She'll ride that line between good and bad behavior. All of us can identify with that. All of us are trying to behave, but often we fail. We say one thing and do another, and Celia's very good at that, to the extent that she even begins to break into some of her tenants' apartments to find out things that only she sort of needs to know. Like I said, I really miss her, and I miss being surprised by her, because as I wrote it, I was very surprised, even by some of her sexual choices. Distinctly un-Playboy. So anyway, I hope you all enjoy it, and I hope you're surprised by it. Picador has been delightful and amazing, and yesterday it was like being at your own funeral when you've had a pretty good life. So I want to thank them and all the editors that brought such passion to this, and all the writers who've helped me along the way. I've edited a lot of people: Margaret Atwood, Joyce Carol Oates. I kept it a secret from them that I wrote, but I certainly was always taking notes. And some of that will hopefully you'll see in the book, and hopefully you'll be moved to take on more interesting characters that hide even while they're showing themselves to you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yes, and just as I compared Eric to Antrim and Holmes, I think if you like Joyce Carol Oates or Roxana Robinson, that you should be definitely taking a look at.
James Salter.
Or James Salter. Please do read The Affairs of Others. So, unfortunately, we do not have time for your questions today, but I hope that you've had a good introduction to these 6 authors and to their books, and that you will be looking for them as they come out in the months ahead. From the Downtown Author Stage here at Book Expo America, I'm Ron Hogan, and this has been Sheri Fink, Eric Lundgren, Katy Butler, Wendy Lauer, Jennifer Senior, and Amy Grace Loyd, your Buzz authors for the fall. And thank you for being here today.